The din of the mess hall was a constant, a symphony of clattering trays and 100 low conversations. Petty Officer First Class Eva Rostova sat alone, an island of calm in the noisy sea of green uniforms. Her tray held a simple meal of chicken and rice. To anyone looking, she was just another fit, serious service member, perhaps an instructor, maybe a logistics officer. The gold trident pin that marked her as a Navy SEAL was hidden, tucked safely under her standard-issue sweatshirt. She was enjoying the anonymity, her first quiet moment after arriving at the new training command. That anonymity shattered when the light around her table dimmed, blocked by 5 broad-shouldered young men. Recruits. Their heads were shaved, their uniforms were still stiff and new, and they moved with the inflated, fragile confidence of a new peer group. The one in the lead, a kid named Miller with a smirk begging for a reason to exist, placed his tray down with a thud. "This is our table," Miller said, his tone not quite aggressive, but layered with a certainty that expected immediate compliance. "Recruits always sit here. You'll need to find another spot." Eva didn't look up from her plate. She speared a piece of chicken with her fork. "I'm almost done." Her voice was even calm. It held no fear, no challenge. It was a simple statement of fact. A second recruit, leaner and more nervous, shifted his weight. "Come on, ma'am. Don't make this a thing. We've had a long day." The ma'am was polite, but the meaning was clear. "Move along." That's when Eva looked up. Her eyes, a calm Arctic blue, scanned each of them. She didn't see malice, just a raw, untested entitlement, and a desperate need to establish a pecking order. She took another slow, deliberate bite, chewing methodically. The silence stretched, becoming heavier than the recruit's presence. Miller's smirk widened into a grin. He leaned forward, planting his hands on the table, caging her in. His voice dropped, losing its false politeness. "Look, we're trying to be polite. But this is our spot. Move. Now." This was the moment. The chatter at the surrounding tables began to die down as others noticed the confrontation. Eva placed her fork down. It made a quiet, precise click that seemed to echo in the sudden hush. 10 seconds had passed since they arrived. She stood up. It wasn't a nervous jump, but a smooth, uncoiling motion, like a spring releasing its tension with perfect control. At 5'8", she was shorter than all of them, but her presence suddenly seemed to expand, filling the space around the table. The recruits, expecting a retreat, were caught off guard by her advance. "You 5, she said, her voice still low, but now cutting through the remaining noise like a blade. "You think you're tough enough to claim a table? Let's see if you're tough enough to keep it." Before Miller could process the challenge, Eva moved. It wasn't an attack. It was a demonstration of pure, effortless control. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the wrist of the hand he had planted on the table. She twisted it into a lock that wasn't meant to break bones, but to dictate movement. A sharp gasp escaped his lips. Using his own momentum against him, she spun him around, guiding him like a dancer into the path of the recruit to his left. They stumbled into each other, a tangle of confusion and shock. As a third recruit lunged forward on instinct, Eva simply sidestepped. She hooked her foot behind his ankle and gave a small, almost gentle push on his back. He crashed into a vacant chair, grabbing it to keep from falling flat on his face. The entire sequence was silent, efficient, and devoid of anger. It was physics applied with devastating skill. 15 seconds had passed. The 2 remaining recruits stood completely frozen, their brains short-circuiting. This wasn't a fight. This was something else entirely. This woman was handling them. The commotion finally drew the attention of a Master Chief Petty Officer, a grizzled veteran with a chest full of ribbons, who had been walking through the hall. He stopped, folded his arms, and watched, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. Eva straightened her sweatshirt. She looked at the 5 recruits, who were now a disheveled, bewildered heap of shame. Miller was cradling his wrist, his face pale with a dawning horror. The Master Chief stepped forward. "Problem here, Petty Officer Rostova?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. The title Petty Officer hit the recruits first. She wasn't a fellow trainee. Then the name, Rostova. Some of them had heard that name in whispers, a story about an operator who had pulled 2 wounded teammates through 3 kilometers of hostile territory. Eva gave a slight shake of her head. "No, Master Chief. Just a misunderstanding about table etiquette. These recruits were just leaving." But the final, crushing blow was yet to come. As she turned to address the Master Chief, the chain around her neck shifted. The small, gold trident pin swung free from the neckline of her shirt, catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the mess hall. It glinted, a small, brilliant accusation. 5 pairs of eyes locked onto it. The eagle, the flintlock, the anchor. The symbol they all dreamed of, but none had earned. The seal trident. The air went out of them. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a cold, sinking reality that was far worse than any physical embarrassment. They hadn't just been picking on a random woman. They had surrounded, threatened, and tried to intimidate a Navy SEAL. 20 seconds later, they realized exactly who she was. The silence she left behind at the table was heavier than any noise the mess hall could produce. The 5 recruits stood rooted to the spot, not daring to move, their faces burning with a humiliation that went deeper than any drill instructor's yell. Miller could still feel the ghost pressure of her grip on his wrist, a precise, non-painful, but utterly inescapable hold that had communicated more about her skill than 1,000 words. He stared at the empty chair where she had been sitting, the simple metal and vinyl object now seeming like a monument to his own foolishness. The Master Chief watched Eva go, his approving nod shifting into a stern, disappointed glare directed at the recruits. He didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes, a mixture of pity and simmering anger, was a punishment in itself. He simply shook his head slowly, a gesture that said, "You have no idea what you just did," before turning to follow her, leaving them alone in their bubble of shame. The normal cacophony of the mess hall slowly returned, but it felt distant, muffled, as if they were hearing it from the bottom of a well. The other soldiers and sailors at nearby tables deliberately avoided looking at them, which was somehow worse than being laughed at. It was a silent consensus of their disgrace. One of the recruits, the lean one who had spoken, finally sank into a chair, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "Rostova," he whispered, the name tasting like ash. "I heard a story about Kynner. They said she carried 2 guys out on her back. Took out a sniper nest alone." The words hung in the air, making the situation feel infinitely worse. They hadn't just disrespected an operator. They had disrespected a legend. Miller finally found his voice, though it was cracked and weak. "She could have destroyed us," he said, not with bravado, but with a terrifying realization. She wasn't even trying. She was just making a point. The memory of how effortlessly she had moved them, like a chess master shifting insignificant pieces, replayed in his mind. There was no anger in her actions, only a devastating competence. It was a level of control he couldn't even comprehend. Across the room, Eva walked alongside the Master Chief, her posture relaxed but perfectly straight. The Master Chief chuckled low, a dry, rasping sound. "Rough first day, Rostova? Had to put the new fish in their place already." Eva allowed a small, tight smile. "Just a teaching moment, Master Chief. They'll learn, or they'll wash out." The lesson was the same. She didn't look back. The incident was already behind her, filed away as a minor administrative task. Her mind was on the afternoon briefing, on the new crop of BUD/S candidates she would be helping to assess. These 5 recruits were a symptom of a larger culture, one she was here to help fix. "But the trident," the Master Chief said, his tone turning serious. "You usually keep that tucked away." "For them it was necessary," Eva replied, her gaze fixed ahead. They needed to see the symbol. The shock of it might be the only thing that makes the lesson stick. Strength isn't about surrounding someone. It's about the weight you carry and how you choose to carry it. She pushed through the double doors leading out of the mess hall, leaving the noise and the shame behind. For her, it was over. For the 5 young men still standing by the table, their real training had just begun. The path to earning a trident of their own suddenly seemed longer, harder, and far more humbling than they had ever imagined. The 5 recruits did not sit at the table. They stood around it like guilty sentries, the empty tray a stark reminder of their transgression. The smell of food that had made their mouths water minutes before now turned their stomachs. Miller's appetite was gone, replaced by a cold, not a shame. He could feel the eyes of the entire mess hall on them, not with mockery, but with a silent, judgmental understanding. They were the fools of the hour. "Let's just go," one of them muttered, his voice barely audible. The idea of eating now was unthinkable. They shuffled away from the table, a tight, silent group, their heads down. They didn't go to another table. They just left, abandoning their full trays. The walk out of the mess hall was the longest of their young careers. Every laugh from another table felt like it was directed at them. Every glance felt like an accusation. Outside, the bright sunlight was a shock. The normal sounds of the base, distant shouts from a drill field, the hum of a generator, seemed to mock their earlier arrogance. They found a quiet spot behind the barracks, a patch of gravel shaded by a large fuel tank. For a long moment, no one spoke. The bravado that had defined their group dynamic had been completely hollowed out. It was the way she moved, the lean recruit Davis finally said, breaking the silence. He was staring at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. It wasn't like in the movies. There was no noise. It was quiet, like she was just rearranging furniture. He mimicked the twisting motion she had used on Miller's wrist, a clumsy, pathetic imitation. Miller rubbed his wrist again. There was no bruise, no pain, just the indelible memory of absolute powerlessness. "She looked right at me," he said, his voice low. Before she even stood up, her eyes, she wasn't scared. She was calculating, like she was already 3 steps ahead. He kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering across the gravel. "We were just a problem to be solved. A minor inconvenience." Another recruit, Jenkins, the one who had been pushed into the chair, spoke up. The Master Chief. He knew her. He called her Petty Officer Rostova. He wasn't mad at her. He was disappointed in us. This realization seemed to hit harder than any physical reprimand. The disapproval of a senior enlisted man like that was a career killer before their careers had even begun. The 5th recruit, the youngest of them all, had been silent until now. "A Navy SEAL," he whispered, the words full of awe and terror. "We tried to push around a Navy SEAL. My dad told me stories about them. He said they're not human. They're something else." He looked at the others, his eyes wide. "What if she reports us? What if we get kicked out?" Miller shook his head, a grim certainty settling over him. "She won't report us. That wasn't the point. The point was that we needed to learn, and she taught us. Getting kicked out would be too easy. This feeling? This is the punishment. We have to live with knowing what we did." He looked at each of them in turn, his earlier smirk replaced by a hard, new resolve. "We keep our mouths shut. We do our jobs. We get through training. And we never, ever forget what happened in there today." The incident in the mess hall was no longer just an embarrassing story. It had become their secret, a foundational lesson written in humiliation. The path to becoming a sailor, a real sailor, suddenly looked very different. It was no longer about being the toughest guy in the room. It was about earning the right to be in the room at all. And somewhere on the base, the woman who had taught them that lesson was already moving on to her next task, the 5 recruits already fading from her thoughts. The rest of their day passed in a fog of anxious monotony. The recruits moved through their scheduled classes on naval history and basic seamanship, but the words from the instructors seemed to come from a great distance. Their minds were trapped in a loop, endlessly replaying those 20 seconds in the mess hall. The confident, booming voice of the chief petty officer teaching them about not tying seemed to echo with a new, unspoken challenge. Every time Miller tried to tie a bowline, his fingers felt thick and clumsy, remembering the effortless precision of Eva's movements. During a physical training session in the afternoon, the lesson took on a physical dimension. The obstacle course, which they had previously tackled with loud, competitive shouts, was now a silent, personal trial. When Davis struggled to haul himself over a high wall, Miller didn't just yell encouragement from the other side. He moved to help, bracing himself to give his teammate a boost, a silent acknowledgement of their shared failure. Their earlier pack mentality, based on dominance, had been shattered and was slowly reforming into something quieter, more cooperative. They were learning that real strength wasn't about standing over someone, but standing with them. Later, as they polished their boots in the barracks under the watchful eye of a junior officer, the silence was finally broken in a meaningful way. Jenkins, staring at the distorted reflection of his face in the toe of his boot, spoke without looking up. "What do you think it takes," he asked quietly, "to be like that? To have that control?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't about being able to fight or being the strongest. They had all been the strongest guy in their hometowns. This was different. It was about the unnerving calm, the absolute certainty. "My grandfather was in the Marines," Miller said, his voice low. "He once told me that anyone can be tough when they're angry. The real test is being effective when you're not. He said the most dangerous men he ever knew were the quiet ones." He looked around at his squad. We were angry. Or we were pretending to be tough, which is just another kind of anger. She wasn't any of that. Davis nodded slowly. It was like she was bored. We were just a minor distraction. The humiliation of that thought was beginning to curdle into a strange kind of motivation. The desire to never be a minor distraction to someone like that again was suddenly a powerful driving force. That evening, they returned to the mess hall for dinner. The walk through the doors was one of the most difficult things they had ever done. The room looked the same, sounded the same, but to them it was entirely different territory. They collected their food without a word, their eyes scanning the room not with arrogance, but with a new wariness and respect. They did not go to the table they had tried to claim. They found a smaller table in a corner, away from the main traffic. As they ate in silence, their eyes were drawn to the empty table where it had all happened. It was just a table again, but it was also a landmark, a silent monument to their own ignorance. They finished their meal quickly, the food tasting like fuel, not triumph. As they stood to leave, Miller paused and looked back one last time. He wasn't seeing the table anymore. He was seeing a future version of himself, one who had learned the lesson that had been so brutally and efficiently delivered. The shame was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was now surrounded by something else, a resolve as hard and sharp as a newly forged blade. The lesson was over. The learning had just begun. The weeks that followed were a study in transformation. The 5 recruits were not singled out for punishment. No official report was filed. But the incident in the mess hall became the invisible crucible that forged them. They were harder on themselves than any drill instructor could ever be. The memory of those 20 seconds became their private drill sergeant, a constant, nagging voice that demanded more. Their training intensified, moving from classroom theory to punishing practical application. They spent days on the water in small, inflatable boats, learning the feel of the ocean that Eva Rostova had known since childhood. The cold spray that stung their faces and the relentless burn in their muscles were no longer just hardships to be endured. They were prerequisites. Miller, his broad shoulders now put to proper use, found a grim satisfaction in the ache of rowing against a tough current. He thought of her father's fishing boat, of a kind of strength that was born not from a gym, but from daily survival. During a land navigation exercise, they got hopelessly lost in a dense, swampy section of the training grounds. The old version of their group would have fractured, with accusations and bluster. Now they simply stopped. Davis, the lean one, calmly pulled out his map and compass. Jenkins consulted his notes. They worked together in quiet, efficient synchronicity, their earlier arrogance replaced by a humble acknowledgement that they needed each other to succeed. They found their way out an hour late, exhausted and covered in mud, but they had found it together. It was a small victory, but it felt more meaningful than any of their previous easy triumphs. One afternoon, their entire training company was assembled on a grinder, a vast asphalt parade ground, for a special briefing. The sun beat down mercilessly. The recruits stood at attention, their uniforms soaked with sweat. The commanding officer introduced a guest speaker, an operator from Naval Special Warfare, who was there to talk about the ethos of the teams. The man who walked to the podium wore a simple polo shirt and tactical pants. But as he turned to face them, a collective, almost imperceptible gasp rippled through the ranks of the 5 recruits. It was the Master Chief from the mess hall. His eyes, like chips of flint, scanned the rows of young faces. They lingered for a fraction of a second on Miller, Davis, Jenkins, and the others. There was no smile, no nod of recognition, just a brief, assessing look that seemed to say, "I remember you." He spoke about integrity, about courage, about the absolute necessity of trusting your teammates with your life. He talked about the weight of the trident, not as a piece of metal, but as a symbol of a relentless standard. "It's not about being the toughest," he growled, his voice carrying easily across the silent grinder. "It's about being the most reliable. It's about making the right choice when no one is watching, and having the fortitude to stand by that choice when everyone is." Every word felt personally directed at them. He was describing the very qualities they had seen in action that day. They had witnessed fortitude. They had seen reliability in its purest form. The lecture was not an abstract ideal. It was a detailed description of the woman who had humbled them. As the Master Chief finished and stepped away from the podium, the recruits didn't just clap. They felt a profound sense of clarity. The path ahead was still long and unimaginably difficult, but it was no longer shrouded in mystery. They had seen a flicker of the destination, and the image was burned into their minds. They had been given a map, written not on paper, but in a lesson of quiet, devastating power. The final phase of their basic training was a 3-day endurance exercise known simply as the Crucible. It was a relentless series of marches, simulated combat scenarios, and problem-solving tests under extreme fatigue and minimal food. The 5 recruits were scattered into different squads, but the lesson of the mess hall had become a part of each of them, a shared ghost that pushed them forward. Miller's squad was tasked with moving a heavy, simulated ammunition crate over 5 miles of rugged terrain. Halfway through, a recruit twisted his ankle badly, his face white with pain. The old impulse, the one that valued the mission above the man, flickered in Miller's mind. But it was quickly extinguished. He saw a flash of calm, blue eyes in his memory, not of anger, but of assessment. He remembered the story of Cunner, of a SEAL who carried her teammates. "We're not leaving him," Miller said, his voice firm, cutting through the squad's grumbling. "Jenkins, help me get him up. Davis, you and Smith take the front of the crate. We rotate. We all finish, or none of us do." It was the first real command decision of his life, and it was rooted not in dominance, but in the unity they had been forced to learn. Miles away, Davis found himself as the navigator for his squad, deep in a dense pine forest at 2 in the morning. They were lost, cold, and arguing. The map was smudged. The compass seemed unreliable. The squad wanted to just pick a direction and run. Davis thought of the effortless precision of Eva's movements, the economy of action. He forced himself to breathe, to block out the panic. He found a small clearing, laid the map on the ground, and used the few visible stars to orient himself. "We go northwest," he said, his voice calm and certain. "Trust me." It was the same quiet authority he had witnessed, and it silenced the arguments. They found their objective an hour later. On the last day, the entire training company, exhausted and caked in mud, assembled for the final march back to the main base. It was a tradition, a final test of spirit. As they trudged up the last long hill, their legs burning, a figure appeared at the crest, silhouetted against the rising sun. It was a lone instructor waiting for them. As the company drew closer, the details became clear. It was Petty Officer Eva Rostova. She stood at perfect ease, her hands behind her back, simply observing. The 5 recruits saw her at the same time. A fresh surge of adrenaline, mixed with a deep, resonant respect, coursed through them. They straightened their backs, found a deeper reserve of strength. They marched past her, not as the arrogant boys from the mess hall, but as a unit, tested and tempered. Miller, leading his squad, dared to look directly at her as he passed. Her gaze met his. There was no smile, no recognition, but for a single fleeting instant, he saw something there. It wasn't approval, not yet. It was something better, assessment. The look a master gives a promising apprentice. It was a look that said, "The lesson has been received." They marched on, toward the waiting ceremony, where they would receive their insignia and become full-fledged sailors. They had not earned a trident. That journey was for another day, a far more distant shore. But they had earned something else, something fundamental. They had earned the right to understand the weight of the symbol she wore. And as the sun warmed their faces, they knew that the 20 seconds that had shamed them had also, ultimately, saved them. The graduation ceremony was held on the same sun-baked grinder where the Master Chief had spoken. The bleachers were filled with proud families, but for the 5 recruits, now officially sailors, the world had narrowed to the firm ground beneath their polished boots and the flags snapping in the breeze. They stood at attention, their uniforms crisp, their faces a mask of hard-earned discipline. The speeches from the commanding officers washed over them, full of words like honor, courage, and commitment. These words no longer felt like abstract concepts. They were now tied to the memory of cold chicken in a mess hall, the sting of salt water, and the crushing weight of an ammunition crate. When the ceremony ended, a chaotic, joyful scene erupted as families flooded onto the field. Mothers cried. Fathers clapped their sons on the back. Girlfriends hugged them tightly. Miller, Davis, Jenkins, and the others were swept into the embraces of their own families. The relief and pride on their loved ones' faces a stark contrast to the trials they had endured. For a few minutes, they were just boys again, home from a long, hard journey. But as the crowd began to thin, Miller spotted a familiar figure standing alone near the edge of the grinder, observing the scene with that same calm, detached expression. It was Eva Rostova. She wasn't in dress uniform, just her standard fatigues, but the sun caught the gold trident pin on her chest. It was the first time they had seen it displayed openly. It seemed to gleam with a light of its own. Miller felt a pull, a need that went beyond words. He excused himself from his family and walked toward her, his heart thudding against his ribs. Davis and Jenkins, seeing him go, broke from their own families and followed. The 5 of them converged, forming a loose semicircle before her. The noisy celebration around them seemed to fade into a distant hum. They stood there for a moment, 5 young sailors facing the woman who had irrevocably changed their path. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a nervous, profound respect. Miller was the one who finally spoke, his voice clear but laced with the vulnerability they all felt. "Petty Officer Rostova," he began, snapping to attention. We wanted to thank you." Eva's gaze swept over them, taking in their new uniforms, their clean-shaven faces, the new confidence that had replaced the old bravado. Her expression remained neutral, but the intensity in her eyes softened by a single degree. "Thank me for what, sailor?" she asked, her tone even, giving nothing away. Miller swallowed. "For the lesson, Chief." In the mess hall. We didn't understand." "We do now." A silence hung between them, filled with the unspoken weight of their transformation. Eva nodded slowly, a single, curt gesture of acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't praise. It was something more powerful, recognition. Recognition that they had listened, that they had learned. "You have your eagle," she said, her eyes flicking to the insignia on his uniform. "That's a start. The Navy gave you that. What you build on top of it, the kind of sailor you become, that's on you. Remember the feeling of being surrounded. Remember the feeling of being the one who surrounds. Then choose which one you want to be." She didn't wait for a reply. She offered a final brief nod, turned on her heel, and walked away, her stride as smooth and purposeful as it had been that day. They watched her go, the symbol on her chest burning itself into their memories one last time. They were sailors now. The first easiest part of their journey was over. The real work, the work of building a character worthy of the uniform, was just beginning. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that they would carry the memory of her and the weight of that trident for the rest of their lives. The 5 sailors did not see Petty Officer Rostova again. Their paths diverged, as paths do in the Navy. They received their orders, scattering to different ships, different fleets, different corners of the world. The aircraft carrier, the destroyer, the support vessel, each became a new classroom, a new proving ground. The memory of the mess hall, however, traveled with each of them like a secret standard. A year later, Miller found himself on the deck of a guided missile destroyer, pitching violently in a storm-tossed sea. A critical cable had snapped during replenishment operations, and a young, panicked seaman was in danger of being swept overboard by the whipping steel rope. The wind screamed, the ship groaned, and chaos threatened to take over. Miller saw the terror in the seaman's eyes, a mirror of his own fear from a year ago. But instead of freezing, he heard a calm, steady voice in his head, a voice that was now his own. "Secure the line. Get a harness on him. Move." He wasn't the largest sailor there, but his commands were clear, his actions decisive. He had learned that leadership wasn't about size. It was about clarity under pressure. On the other side of the world, Davis was in a crowded foreign port, navigating the chaotic neon-lit streets with his shipmates. A brawl erupted outside a bar between 2 groups of sailors from different navies. The old temptation to jump in, to prove something, was strong. But Davis remembered the quiet power of walking away. He remembered that true strength was having the option to fight and choosing not to. He instead helped corral his own shipmates, de-escalating the situation and leading them calmly back to the ship, avoiding an international incident. He had learned that restraint was not weakness, but a higher form of control. For Jenkins, the lesson came during a long, monotonous watch in the engine room, the air thick with heat and the hum of machinery. A more senior technician, lazy and cutting corners, told him to falsify a logbook entry. "No one will ever know," the man said with a smirk. Jenkins thought of the Master Chief's words about integrity, about doing the right thing when no one is watching. He remembered the look of disappointment more than any look of anger. "The log stays accurate," Jenkins said, his voice firm. He reported the technician, knowing it would make him unpopular. He had learned that respect for the rules was the foundation of respect for oneself. They did not communicate often, these 5 men bound by a single, humiliating moment. But when they did, in brief emails or rare port visits, they never spoke of parties or adventures first. They always asked, "How are you doing?" And the question meant, "Are you still measuring up? Are you still remembering?" The mess hall incident was their touchstone, the day they were broken down and shown what they could become. They were not SEALs. They would likely never earn that trident. But in their own ways, on their own decks, and in their own engine rooms, they were building a different kind of strength. They were becoming the sailors that Petty Officer Rostova had forced them to be, not through punishment, but through an unforgettable example. The lesson had not been about how to fight. It had been about how to be. And that was a lesson that would last a lifetime.